Welcome. I'm Carl Frederick, and I will be interviewing individuals for Kenosha Voices, an oral history project of the Kenosha County Historical Society in conjunction with Kenosha Community Media. I have worked in newspapers for more than 40 years as an editor and a reporter. 38 and a half of those years were at the Kenosha News. I am also a member of the Kenosha County Historical Society Board. We hope you enjoy these programs. I'm speaking with Dick Swartz, former owner of the Swartz Nurseries, which is currently located on 30th Avenue north of 18th Street. Welcome, Dick. How are you today?
I'm good.
Good, thank you. When did you get started in the landscaping business?
Well, I grew up with my father ran the nursery, and so I worked in the nursery all my life. And then probably after I got out of college is when I actually took over running the nursery.
Okay, how did the nursery get started?
Well, it goes way back in 1888. My great-grandfather, John Jacob Swartz, gave my grandfather, John Frederick Swartz, or John F. Swartz, we always call him, 1 acre of land to grow ornamental plants. At the time, they grew a lot of grapes and strawberries and all kinds of fruit plants for sale. They'd pick the fruit and sell them.
So it was a fruit business initially.
It was and a farming business.
Okay, and that was beginning in
1888 is when
the ornamental plants. But when did the farm start initially?
My family, the Swartz family, came to Wisconsin in 1849, and when they're in Kenosha, they lived in Kenosha for maybe 7 to 9 years, I guess, and then they bought land out where Parkside presently is, and we had 57 acres of nursery stock there. Eventually, that was bought in smaller parcels.
Okay. And you say, why did it go to an ornamental type of plant business in 1888?
Well, my grandpa was interested in it. They were just selling mainly, they buy in plants and fruit plants mainly, and he saw a market for selling ornamental plants, primarily I think perennials back then. And he would go out and canvass the neighborhood and find people in the winter that were interested in buying and write up orders. And most of the orders were like $1, $1.50. It was just a few plants. They were very inexpensive back then.
Okay. And when did you first get involved with the business? Were you a teenager? Were you younger?
Well, I got through high school in '58, and then I decided that I should go to college and get a degree in landscape architecture at Wisconsin. And it was in the Department of Horticulture, and then I got the degree, and I had some very good professors there. Mainly I was interested in plants. Professor Hasselkus really was a great teacher on plants and inspires everybody to be interested. And you're always looking for different new plants and all that. So when I got out of college, I spent 6 months in the Army Reserve active duty, and then I basically took over running the nursery. My father still worked in the nursery and handled a lot of things, but I basically did most of the sales.
Okay. Did you have a job with the business before you graduated from high school?
No.
No, not at all. Okay. And you came back then with a degree in landscape architecture. What was the first kind of jobs that you were interested in or started?
Well, we generally, as a nursery, grew our own trees pretty much. Back then, we didn't buy too many things in to sell. The nursery business back then was you dug in the spring and the fall. When the plants were dormant, they were usually dug what we call bare root, no soil or pots or anything. And some nurseries would store them in a barn at just above freezing temperature, and we would buy some of those plants. And then we grew our own, and we would dig them, but we didn't have any really income in the summer, so we did other things in the summer. My grandfather started with a big strawberry business. We had, I think, 14 acres of strawberries at one time, and we'd hire kids from the north side of Kenosha to come out and pick strawberries, and we'd ship them to the market down in Chicago.
When was the land on 30th Avenue purchased?
Well, that's a sore point there, but we were very similar to the situation at Foxconn, where we were forced to sell our land. The university wanted to have a campus in the area. They got a committee, and each county board in Racine and Kenosha decided to buy any land they picked. But they are thinking it's going to go where Bradford normally is right now, or in Racine somewhere. And the committee decided they'd pick the best land, and we were right in the middle of it. So basically, I don't know when the sale actually happened. It's probably 65 or something like that. We stayed on the land for 5 years that we could move plant material off of it.
Okay. Did you have the land at 30th Avenue before Parkside?
Right. My grandpa bought some land right near 18th and 30th Avenue, and approximately, I think, 1911. Oh no, it was probably 1908 or so. He bought the land, and so when Parkside came along and took our land, we had the 57 acres by Parkside. We moved our 2 houses from that land to the land on 30th Avenue, and we started growing plants there.
So plants have been growing there since the early 20th century.
Yeah, right. They, at one time during the 30s or the late 20s, they grew a lot of elm trees, and part of my early years was the elm trees got old and started getting Dutch elm disease when that came along in probably the early 50s, and we spent a lot of time cutting down elm trees for years.
Okay, so how did you do your job? I mean, in 1964, 65, you would sell a plant or plants to a customer. What would you do then?
Well, we started out of retail sales too, so people would come out, pick out plants, and take them home themselves and sell them. Mm-hmm. But then we were contacted by people who wanted to plant their home, and I would go look at it and make out a sketch or a drawing and suggest what they would put in. In some cases, they'd want to come out and see the plants at the nursery, but quite often they would just hire us to do it, and we would take the plants and take them to their house, and we'd install them.
And if they had something planted there already, you took them out?
Yeah, we would. It was all hand labor then. You just come in with our spades were like an axe. You could just chop out the roots of the other plants in most cases. We barely had to saw anything down or anything, but it was a case we did the removal and removed the debris, and then we would plant our new plants and grade it out and be all done with it.
So some of those plants must have had some pretty deep roots. Took a while to get them out.
Yeah, you'd be surprised. The trick to digging out a big spruce tree, say, is to go down deep enough and then undercut it. And we would hire guys, and they'd come out there and they'd be whacking away and not getting anywhere. But I would work alongside of them, and I would dig out a tree before they'd get anywhere near it, because then I'd tell them that the secret, you got to get down deep and use a sharp spade, and you can undercut it, and down it goes.
Okay, things that happened since you were working by hand, what kind of changes in the business made it easier for you to do the work? Or now your 2 sons are operating the business?
Right, Doug and Dan are twin boys, and they both work well together.
Okay. Were there any particular skills that you had to learn when you came back from college to do the job, or were there already, you knew what you needed to do because you were trained in college?
I had done enough of it before that I knew what I had to do. It's you know, I was not a natural salesperson is the only thing. I mean, sales, some guys can sell easily. I just sold our product basically, and myself. I didn't try to push people to do something they didn't want to do.
How many employees does the business have today?
Well, this is sort of the off season yet, but usually we have about 10 or 12 people working for us, a couple salespeople in the sales yard.
How many were there when you were working in the business?
We were a smaller crew, but we were about 8 usually, I'd say.
And how many different jobs could you do with that 8-man staff?
It all depends. A lot of the homes that went up in our area was the north side of Kenosha were small front yards, and we'd usually do a job every day.
Okay, how did you find your staff?
Well, it's interesting. Generally, throughout the time I was running the nursery, most of the staff was Hispanic. The workers, a family would come up and they'd have 2, 3 brothers that would work for us, and they're always hard workers, and we got along good. We had some college kids sometimes working, primarily in the summer.
Did you have any trouble keeping staff or ever finding any staff?
No, I think we always had as many people as we wanted. The sales yard, we needed some people who were trained in plant material, and I think we were fortunate most of the time to have enough. We needed probably 2 people at least to handle the sales yard, and usually we'd have at least one person who's very knowledgeable.
Okay. What hours were you working in the business when you were in charge of the operation?
Well, we usually worked an 8-hour day, 8 to 5, and an hour for lunch. Nowadays, they depends on the season. They used to start earlier and quit earlier.
Okay. Did you develop any friendships with any of the people you worked with?
Well, the employees we always got along good with, but we also, I got involved in a lot of organizations, and I was in the American Nursery Association, the Wisconsin Nursery Association, the Southeast Wisconsin chapter of the WLCA, and so I met a lot of competitors and fellow nurserymen and landscapers, and we'd have meetings on a regular basis, and so we made friendships that way too.
Okay. Do you remember any kind of special or strange orders that you received over time that kind of made you shake your head or something?
Yeah, it's a lot of strange ones, but I can't put my finger on it right now. But some people were characters, I'll tell you. I mean, you go and work for somebody, and we actually in the summer we used to do some trimming for people, trim their shrubs when we weren't busy in the summer. And my brother and I'd be working. I'd be in the front, and he'd be in the back. And this was before I really ran the nursery, but. And the lady'd come out and ask me a question, and then she'd go back and ask him the same question to see if we gave the same answer. You run into that a lot.
Okay. Can you speak to any changes in the business that have occurred over time that made the job easier?
Well, the first thing, the plant material, how you handle it changed dramatically. When I mentioned you would store the plants in the winter, and then we would pot them up, some of them, and sell them bareroot a lot of times. And then nurseries started growing plants in pots. And for our nursery, we grew plants in the field like shade trees and all that. And we would hand dig them when I was younger. And then eventually we got a trencher, a little small trencher that you trench it. And after we got done trenching all the trees, it looked like a battlefield, like your crane is right now, kind of holes all over the place. And then eventually we got a couple tree spades, and the tree spades made it a lot easier. You'd pop the tree out, you had a wire basket you'd put down, you'd put some burlap inside of it, you'd set the tree inside of that, you'd rope the top, and then you crimp the basket, and it's real easy to handle the trees then.
Yeah. How about computerization? Did that come into the business?
Yeah, my sons really started that. They of course grew up in the computer era, and they had actually in college, we bought one of the first IBM computers. They were the envy of their friends in college because they had a computer that they could use. But now they got computers that they can design. They do a lot of hardscaping with patios and all that, retaining walls and that. And they can put it in the computer, and it'll figure out how much material they take, how much block, how much stone, everything else. Really makes it a lot easier. And it's hard in the old days to sit on the drawing board and draw a plan that took you hours, and now they can do it a lot faster and a better job probably.
Okay, how about the trends in the type of plants that people are interested in or were interested in? How did that evolve?
Yeah, when I started way back, generally there was mostly evergreens that were planted on plantings. when I started, we started using a lot of ground covers. These are plants that you spread, a mass planting in an area, different plants. And all of a sudden, some of the perennial growers started growing, people who grew the ground covers started growing perennials, and this became the rage. And now, right now, some of the biggest businesses with perennials. Now, sometimes some plants were a fad for a while. Before perennials, you were looking for color, and so you would try to find a plant that flowered all summer. Well, there weren't any. Potentilla flowered pretty well in the summer sometimes. Then the spirea were real popular, and some of those came in different colors, like yellowish colors and red and all that. And so that kept evolving. Right now, the hot plant is hydrangeas. There's more hydrangeas you can shake a stick at because they're the popular plant right now.
Yeah, how about, you mentioned Dutch elm disease and how that changed planting those types of trees. What happened in other plants as other trees took over? Did they end up with similar problems as the elm trees did?
Yeah, well, of course, recently the emerald ash borer came along, and they took, I think, made up 30% of the trees in our forest, and it took almost all of them out in this area. There's a few around, but, and so there's so many trees that have problems. Spruce trees have problems, pine trees have problems, and it makes it really hard when you're doing a job for somebody to select a plant that you think will be around in 20 years or 30 years.
So do you, or your sons today, do they tell people that if you want to plant something like this is pretty much how long it'll last because it is susceptible to some kind of a disease or insect?
We try to, like for pine, we don't grow too many Austrian pine or Bosnian pine or some of those anymore, but white pine are still pretty good. At one time we didn't use white pine in this area because they need a low pH to grow properly, but we've been very successful with white pine, for instance, instead of using some of the other pine.
Okay. Have there been any national events, economy changes that affect the nursery business?
Not that I can really say right offhand, no.
Okay. What do you, would you say is the best part of your job?
Well, I always like plants, and it was always interesting to find new varieties that were interesting to grow and had desirable characteristics. And so I was always taking pictures of plants, and to remember, I'd go to arboretums and see plants that I thought were interesting, take pictures of them, and then we'd look in catalogs and see if we could buy those plants. And so that's continuing. I know my sons are always come up with new things. When I look back I got a lot of old pictures I took years ago, and a lot of plants I liked we don't grow anymore, and I kind of wonder why, but there's so many new introductions that come out with different plants that some of the old plants that we thought were kind of a ratty plant, now there are some nice introductions now that are worth growing.
Okay, and as you stroll the neighborhood or happen to on a walk see a tree or a shrub that isn't doing well, what would be the most common problem that people face when?
Well, my biggest gripe probably is how they're pruned. Evergreens were meant to look kind of natural when you use them. The designers generally think of a nice, graceful, spreading juniper, and we generally would prefer a lot of trees, and evergreens in particular, to trim with the hand shears. And nowadays they got these electric clippers, and they just start with the least resistance, so they tend to make them look little cubes and squares and all kinds of things that isn't natural. You'll see in a lot of commercial jobs where the plants were planted 6 or 8 feet apart, intending to eventually grow together, and now they just keep them in little 3-foot balls or something like that. So I don't like that. I like the natural looking plants.
Right.
And trees and shrubs. I mean, people just butcher them sometimes just because they can.
Because they can. Do you think it's because the tool is dull, or does it matter? It can be a sharp electric.
It's probably more of a problem when they're sharp, and then they can cut cut pretty deep with their electric clippers and all that. And
And that can
some
damage.
people, and there's so many mistakes made in landscaping. I mean, mulches are used commonly. We generally use shredded bark. There's all kinds of stone mulches. Usually have to use a weed barrier underneath them. But people get these shredded bark and they pile it up around the trees 2-3 tall like a little volcano, and that's detrimental to the tree. The bark should be exposed to the air.
Okay. Well, thank you for your time today, Dick. It was wonderful hearing your
All right.
story.
All right, thank you. Thanks
Thank
for having
you.
me.